Studies Section 5. The idea of conceptual scheme. Introduction. In the last studies section, you have seen that one of the significant functions of concepts is to assist human beings in organizing their experiences. Such concepts become more useful because they also assist different cultures to come to relate and cope with their experiences as a people. The purpose of this study section is to develop the thought addressed in study section 3, that is, analyze the relationship between concepts and the idea of conceptual scheme, and further examine the role of concepts in the conceptual framework that allows a culture to analyze, interpret, understand, and relate with the universe. Learning outcomes for study section 5. When you have studied this section, you should be able to highlight the role of concepts in the organization of human experience, explain the need for a coherent framework of concepts, identify the role that such a framework plays in cultural understanding of the universe. Conceptual schemes. There are so many cultures in the world, and each culture is constrained by different cultural and physical circumstances. In other words, a particular culture may have a particular environmental condition in the universe to deal with. This implies that the experience of an Eskimo, for instance, will likely be different from that of a Kalahari bushman. The point, therefore, is that though each one of us, as members of different cultures, inhabit the same universe, we confront different aspects of this universe. The way we actually conceptually structure our experience will likely differ from culture to culture. Cultures relate to their environment, and you can understand it through the conceptual framework they have developed over time. The evolution of any culture strictly depends on the capacity its people have to confront and cope with their physical and non-physical environments. This involves, for instance, the use of concepts and conceptual categories to classify things into edible and inedible, safe and hostile, good and bad, hot and cold, beautiful and ugly, and so on. All these concepts enable the culture to structure and explain everything else they needed to successfully ensure their survival, not only in terms of the basic biosocial necessities of food, clothing, and shelter, but also cultural needs, that is, the need for social and cultural identity, and psychic need, that is, the need for self-dignity, sexual expressions, and human communication. Oladipo, 2008, 80. It is this conceptual framework that distinguishes one culture from another, and to a large extent gives such a culture a cultural perception of a universe different from that of others. What is a conceptual framework? According to Donald Davison, conceptual schemes are ways of organizing experience. They are systems of categories that give form to the data sensation. They are point of views from which individuals, cultures, or periods survey the changing scene. Cited in Bonin and Yu, 2004, 136. What this implies is that given the organized conceptual framework which a culture or an individual has developed from their confrontation with the universe, every other experiences and circumstances they confront is made meaningful through the existing framework. The conceptual scheme becomes a sort of cultural lens by which we view and understand events, ideas, circumstances, and experiences. Imagine, for example, an individual whose conceptual scheme is seriously conditioned by the Christian or Islamic principles. Such an individual already has the conceptual weapon that enables him or her to relate with an experience in life. Imagine further that such an individual is confronted with the issue of, say, barrenness for a period of 7 years. What do you think is the likely reaction of this individual? Of course, she or he is likely going to interpret the situation as a spiritual attack from whatever source. This interpretation is possible because she or he already has an underlying set of ideas and principles by which she or he relates with reality. This conceptual structure therefore defines for her what is good, true, beautiful, and right. For Harold Brown, a set of concepts and propositions that provide a framework for describing and explaining items of some subject matter along with criteria for recognizing which phenomena are to be considered deviant and in need of explanation. For example, ancient astronomers thought of planets as moving in circular paths at constant speed and attempted to reduce observed non-circular motions to systems of underlying circular motions that appear non-circular from our perspective. 1995, 146. State one advantage of cultural framework. Cultures relate with their environment through cultural framework. Idea of conceptual scheme. Let's examine what philosophers have said about the idea of conceptual scheme. The philosophical argument for conceptual scheme. Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, was the first person to articulate the idea of a conceptual scheme. This is the first part of Kant's argument. 1. This idea came from his attempt to understand the extent of human knowledge. In other words, Kant wanted to understand what is possible for humans to know and what they cannot know. This is to respond to the protracted debate between the empiricists who claim that knowledge is only possible through sense experience and the rationalists who argue that knowledge is derived from reason. According to him, the only world man can claim to have any knowledge of is the world constituted by the human mind. This is the world of trees, stones, rains, clouds, lions, chairs, and so on that we are used to. The knowledge that man cannot go beyond this constituted world. Thus, we can argue, according to Kant, that human experience is already structured in space and in time. But since space and time are categories that are not part of our experience, then we must argue that they are features independent of our experience. In other words, space and time that circumscribe our experience are necessary ingredients of the way things appear to our senses. This would therefore imply, Kant argues, that the world as it is independent of our experience should be distinguished from the world as we experience it. It is therefore the world as we experience it through the categories of space and time that we can truly claim to know. 2. The second part begins with the claim that what is presented to the human mind through space and time does not really constitute knowledge. This is because the mind just receives them passively. The mind receives the sensory information as series of impressions that are chaotic and unorganized, and hence does not give any picture of a stable and rule-governed environment, IBID. What is therefore received from the environment only serves as the raw material for knowledge. There is a further need to translate these raw materials into knowledge. What is required in this regard is for the mind to actively confront these raw materials by imposing on it divisions, classifications, and various kinds of ordering, IBID2. The mind achieves this ordering of the raw materials of the senses through the application of concepts. These concepts could be a priori concept that can be justified or known independent of human experience, or a posteriori which is known through experience. Since there is no problem with knowing a posteriori, Kant's attention is focused on the a priori precondition for human experience and knowledge. It is this a priori concept that acts as the systemizing framework for the disorderly impressions of the sense. It therefore becomes clear from this philosophical argument for what we know that everyone confronts the universe and acquires the knowledge of what is innate through a conceptual scheme. This implies, as we have earlier noted, that the conceptual scheme we have developed stands between us and the universe as we know it. In other words, we can only manage knowledge of the world as it is presented to us through the conceptual categories we have established. Kant, however, holds that every human person shares a universal conceptual scheme which allows us to see the world as it is, in spite of the cultural and historical diversities we have in the world. Other philosophers' argument for conceptual scheme. Gottfried Herder challenged this assumption as being inconsistent. If there are cultural diversities in the world, it is certainly strange to assume that this diversity can be served in the same way by one universal conceptual scheme. What makes a culture strange to us, in the first place, is that it has a conceptual scheme that is different from ours. And this is so because that culture has developed its own conceptual framework for perceiving the universe. Foray. According to Foray, suppose there is an ancient text or an alien people which or who we find difficult to understand. We are trying to make sense of what is written or said, because what we come up with seems strange, irrational, or outright crazy. If there is no clear evidence to the contrary, we prefer to regard the other as a sensible being. But then the oddity calls for an explanation. If the other is just as sensible as we are, how come our ways seem so weird? It is at this point that the notion of conceptual scheme comes in. The weirdness is due to the fact that she is using a different conceptual scheme. Once you manage to explore a conceptual scheme, you shall find that viewed from within a scheme, our opinions are reasonable and well motivated, or at least our mistakes are not that numerous or serious. Therefore, a transition from Kant's universal conceptual scheme to a multiplicity of historically and culturally motivated schemes is now made. What conclusions do you think we can begin to derive from this understanding of the plurality of conceptual schemes which serve as the frameworks by which different cultures understand their world and act within it? Let us examine these conclusions. Conceptual schemes and relativism. If a particular culture has its own unique framework for understanding and interpreting the world, it implies that you can only begin to understand that culture or society only within the context of that framework. Consider, for instance, that a particular culture believes that the highest honor it could pay any person when she or he dies is to eat the dead body. Thus, if a man loses his wife, the man can only honor the wife's memory by eating the body. Other members of the community also honor the dead woman by partaking of the body. This would appear horrifying, isn't it? Consider the reverse. A person from that culture also visits your culture and met a burial ceremony. It got to the point that the dead body had to be lowered into the ground. Imagine that. Immediately you lower the dead body into the ground, this person from the other culture suddenly started throwing up. And when you ask him or her, he or she said she just couldn't understand why you would give a last respect to a loved one by throwing his or her body into the ground for worms to eat. How, for instance, do we arrive at a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of each act of burial? Can you reasonably accuse the other culture of cannibalism? The issues concerned goes beyond the idea of morality to the very fundamentals of thought. In other words, if thought is only meaningful from within a particular conceptual scheme, how is it possible for other conceptual schemes to understand that thought? One serious implication is that communication becomes impossible since you cannot even begin to formulate that thought into a different language or conceptual scheme. Furthermore, whatever is true, moral, right, and beautiful would depend on what a conceptual scheme takes it to be. What is therefore right for me will not be right for others. However, it seems that relativism, conceptual, ethical, and linguistic, and so on, is inherently wrong. The simple argument is this: people actually pass moral and conceptual judgments on other cultures. For example, a lot of us claim that the terrorist attack on the United States is morally inexcusable. We have also judged that the killing of twins, infanticide, genocide, and other such acts are morally wrong. Apart from this, it is a fact that people communicate across cultures. Therefore, we can conclude that relativism is wrong. This conclusion immediately affects how we think about conceptual schemes. One plausible explanation is that while we may continue claiming that conceptual schemes respond to cultural and historical dynamics, all conceptual schemes interpret the same universe but interpret it differently with the aid of different theoretical frameworks or vocabularies which are amenable to cross-cultural interpretation and understanding. Summary of Study Section 5. In Study Section 5, you have learned that 1. There are so many cultures in the world, and each culture is constrained by different cultural and physical circumstances. Each one of us, as members of different cultures, inhabits the same universe. We confront different aspects of the universe. 2. Cultures relate to their environment, and you can understand it through the conceptual framework they have developed over time. The evolution of any culture strictly depends on the capacity its people have to confront and cope with their physical and non-physical environments. 3. A conceptual scheme is the consequence of our attempt to understand the universe in which we live so as to be better able to cope with its accidents and circumstances, and also to be able to act in a rational manner within it. 4. According to Donald Davidson, conceptual schemes are ways of organizing experience. They are systems of categories that give form to the data of sensation. They are points of views from which individuals, cultures, or periods survey the changing scene. 5. A sketch of a philosophical argument emanating from Immanuel Kant outlined a conceptual scheme as the attempt to know the object of human experience. This gave us the implication from Kant that there is only one universal conceptual scheme. 6. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, was the first person to articulate the idea of a conceptual scheme. This idea came from his attempt to understand the extent of human knowledge. 7. The fact that cross-cultural communication is possible, it also follows that cultures don't inhabit different worlds. Rather, all cultures confront the same universe but with different theoretical vocabularies which are not incommensurable or radically different. 8. The empiricists claim that knowledge is only possible through sense experience. The rationalists argue that knowledge is derived from reason. 9. This conclusion was rejected by others who claim that the fact of historical and cultural diversities leads to the fact of different conceptual schemes following cultural peculiarities. If there are different conceptual schemes, and if a conceptual scheme outlines a people's worldview, then it would follow that different cultures may not be able to communicate or interact, since what is implied in my conceptual scheme may be strange to you. This is the end of Studies Section 5. Thanks for listening.